Oh, here he is. Hello, Martin. Wonderful.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. We've assembled from 64 countries across the world to hear you, Martin. And you're very kind to join us. And I was just saying that your book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, is really required reading for all those in the impact movement who want to develop new tools to improve people's lives, reduce inequality, and reverse climate change. And your book gives chapter and verse on the crisis of capitalism. May I ask you, how and why have we got the huge social inequalities, first of all, that we see today created by capitalism?
Well, that's a very big topic to answer in a short time. I think there are basically two things that have gone along together at the same time, two big, huge forces. First, there were some absolutely fundamental changes in the economy, within our economies and globally, and they can be put in very neatly, but it's a too simple, on two little baskets. One is technology and the other is globalization, which fundamentally altered the balance of economic power within our societies, to put it very crudely, towards capital, including very high quality human capital, and away from pretty well everyone else. So that's the outside force. But in addition, we made a slew of policy and political changes on taxation, on how taxes are worked, on regulation, on competition policy, which essentially tolerated what I call, and that's not a term that I really like using, a form of rentier capitalism, a form in which the people at the top of the capitalist system are able to extract rent from everybody else. And I think these are two forces which to some degree have gone together, because over time, quite naturally, as wealth has concentrated and income has concentrated at the top, so as we've seen many, many times before in the past, has political power.
And when you give numbers like the gap between the average CEO salary in the United States and the average employee salary, which have increased over the last 40 years, if my memory is right, from 40 times CEO to employee salary to 349 times today.
That is correct.
And you also mentioned that if you look at the improvement in the real incomes of the top percentiles, the top 1 to 10% of the population versus the rest of the population, the top percentiles improved their standard of living, I think it was over 25 years, by nearly 100%, and the rest by 14%.
Both of these figures are correct. I've just checked them.
Okay.
So it is rather a striking increase in inequality towards the top, and even more so towards the very, very top.
And what your book says is that actually capitalism is the spouse of democracy. What has been the influence of these inequalities on democracy and democratic leadership?
Well, this is a complicated story again, but I start with what I think is a rather wonderful quotation from Aristotle, of all people, 2,500 years ago, who basically says, if you want a stable democracy, and the Greeks had lots of experience with it, though a different form from ours, direct democracy rather than representative democracy, you need a powerful middle class. And what we have seen, without a doubt, is the erosion of the status and security and sense of optimism in the future of the middle class, by which I mean skilled and unskilled, predominantly manual workers, people who don't go to university. They feel they are economically the losers. Deindustrialization has played a huge part in that, for sure. And of course, so is globalization, but they also feel they are socially despised. And when they look at the twin elites of our society, the intellectual elite and the commercial elite, they feel neither has their interests at heart. And that, in my view, is why really across the Western world, we are seeing this increasing desire to support demagogues, particularly right-wing demagogues, who talk to them and seem to respect them. We have lost, in other words, the loyalty to democracy of a very significant part of our populations. I think that's why Brexit happened, and I think that's why Trump remains such a dominant figure in American politics.
And of course, we see this across the whole world now, the rise of populist leadership, which is promising solutions to people who feel frustrated and disaffected by the things that you've been talking about, the inequalities. Now, in your book, you come to the conclusion that we have to revive citizenship, the feeling of citizenship. And I just want you to expand a bit on that, because as you know, what the impact movement is trying to do is to change our economies so that everybody benefits more equally. By bringing the impact transparency, which we just were discussing with Alison Heron-Lee and Emmanuel Faber, which impact accounting, in good part because of our efforts in this great hall here in Malaga today, the arrival of impact accounting, which enables us to compare the employment impact of a company in terms of diversity or differences in wages or underpaying people below the living wage, advancement of people in companies, and put an economic cost to that and express it in monetary terms, while doing the same for the environmental impacts of companies and the creation of the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, which is a GSG initiative at Harvard Business School. As you know, you wrote about it very kindly in the Financial Times, showed that if you can begin to manage, to measure in monetary terms the impacts of companies, then you begin to get insights that we don't have today. One of the insights on the environmental front was that out of 3,000 companies whose impacts we measured and expressed in monetary terms, 450 create more damage in a single year than they do in profit. 1,000 create damage equivalent to a quarter or more of their profits. And when you come to diversity, which in the social area nobody has really tried to measure before in the way that we have done, if you view it as the economic cost to a community, a gender community or an ethnic community, of not being employed, and you take those salaries and you multiply them by the difference between the demographics around an Amazon facility and the demographics within it, then you see a diversity deficit for Amazon of $6.5 billion a year, versus Apple at $2.5 billion a year. But if you relate it to the wage bill of these two companies, then you see that Amazon's actually the better performer, with 16% diversity deficit versus Apple's 25%. Do you feel that your concept of greater citizenship is dependent on the availability of information of this kind in the hands of consumers, employees, governments, regulators, and of course, investors?
Well, my view is very much that you can't make changes without knowledge of what needs to be changed. So measurement is generally extremely important on all dimensions in society and certainly in business. But I suppose I would say it's a necessary condition for improvement, but not a sufficient one. There also has to be action that follows from this measurement. And this, when I think of citizenship, I think of the idea that business, the society at large and government are in some fundamental respect in a partnership, and they envisage themselves as being in a partnership because they share a polity, and the polity I want to be a democratic one, which means that everybody must feel reasonably content with how it's working. And that means there has to be a pretty high level of cooperation among these various elements to ensure that, as near as possible, everybody in society feels they are valued and have a productive future. So measure absolutely, but act also.
And when you talk of action, we can see consumers now in France using an app to make their purchases. More than 20 million consumers are using the Yuka app. And the information that they're getting is the impact on their health from consuming these products. But they could quite as easily get information about the pollution that the company providing these products is creating, or the social good or harm that company again is creating in the world. It seems to me that because we have today three powerful trends in the world trying to reverse the trends of the past, which you describe so brilliantly in your book, the change in values among young people, started among young people, but became noticed by investors, that if young people don't consume the products of their companies, this has a big implication for the profitability of their portfolios. And we've seen 40 trillion of ESG capital flow because of that. Huge improvements, leaps in technology today that enable us to deliver impact globally. And finally, this force of impact transparency, which enables us to move the valuation of companies because we can measure their impacts alongside their financial performance. It seems to me that these are the tools that citizens need in order to provide the action that you require. And that the big question then is, does government once again begin to redistribute wealth? You talk about how government has moved away from that and distribution of income and wealth. So can you just give us your closing comments about how you see citizenship reversing the trends that we've been talking about and redressing capitalism?
Well, let me just touch on a couple of aspects of this. I think we have to start by saying, and this is something that I think only the public sector can do, that basically every child in society needs to have a reasonable start, have the prospect of a decent education and a future. And of course, as we know very, very well, because of extreme disadvantage in many, even in rich societies, this is simply not happening. And that seems to me an absolutely essential moral obligation for a successful society. It's what places like Denmark have successfully achieved, and I think it's what every society, every rich society should be aiming for. I think that we should be thinking about more democracy in the business, more voice for workers, for people in the business. Meanwhile, at the government level, I think that there are two areas which seem to me obvious. We need much stronger competition policy. We have failed very significantly in this regard, and I think the new ideas here are ones I support. And secondly, we really do have to do at the government level what only government can do, which is create a framework within which the great environmental challenges of our time, above all climate, will actually effectively be tackled. And governments have been too frightened to do this because they haven't tried to persuade the people of the necessity of this. So here are 4 areas, 2 in business and 2 by politicians, and there are lots more in my book, which are, I think, very, very urgent. It has to be, as it were, a whole of society approach. And in some areas, like in climate, it has to be a whole of the world approach. The ambition has to be colossal, and we're not showing any of it.
Thank you so much, Martin, for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to work with you very closely. Thank you.
Pleasure.